He had been her husband for 30 years. They shared a bed, a home, a son, and countless silent dinners. But one day, she looked across the table and realized she no longer recognized the man sitting there. That evening, she packed a pillow, walked down the hall, and closed the guest room door behind her. That door was supposed to be the end. But what if separation wasn't the final chapter? What if emotional distance was the beginning of something new, something even more honest than love? This is not a story about falling back in love. It's about what happens when two people stop pretending, start listening, and choose a different kind of connection. Stay with us. This is a story about release, rediscovery, and the quietest kind of transformation. It had been 30 years since Linda and Frank Carter moved into the little beige house on Mulberry Street. Back then, it was the dream: 2 steady jobs, a healthy son, and matching recliners in the living room. Now, the recliners were still there, but the dreams had long worn out. Every morning, Linda poured 2 cups of coffee, just like she always had. She placed one in front of Frank, who sat at the far end of the kitchen table, eyes fixed on the muted TV above the fridge. He didn't say thank you. She didn't expect him to. They hadn't had a real conversation in weeks. Just fragments. The trash goes out tomorrow. We're out of milk. Your doctor called. Words without warmth, like echoes in an empty room. And that morning was no different, until he broke the silence. This electric bill's up again, Frank grumbled, holding the envelope as if it personally offended him. Linda didn't look up from her toast. That's the AC. It's been over 90 all week. You're the one home all day now? That was it. 7 words. But they cut like glass. Linda placed her knife down carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter the fragile piece. What exactly are you saying? Frank shrugged, the way men do when they don't want to fight but don't want to back down either. I'm saying I wasn't the one running up the electricity. Linda leaned back in her chair and laughed, but there was no humor in it. I see. So now I'm a drain on the utilities. That's rich. Don't twist my words. I don't have to. They're already sharp enough. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. There was a time when they shared everything: chores, finances, dreams, even fears. Now, they only seem to share air and square footage. Frank had retired 2 years ago from the Department of Motor Vehicles. The job hadn't been glamorous, but it gave him routine, purpose, and lunch breaks with the same coworkers every Tuesday. Since retirement, though, he'd been adrift, sitting in silence, reading the paper he didn't absorb, watching baseball he didn't care about. Linda had retired 6 months later. She'd been a bank officer, good with numbers and even better with people. But no one applauds when you retire from being a wife. She had expected some kind of golden era, a chance to travel, maybe start painting again, reconnect with Frank, Eol. Instead, their home had become a cold museum of shared history, photo albums they never opened, wedding china they never used, and a couch that sat two but comforted no one. Their son Jason called once a week. He lived in Chicago with his fiancée. "How are you guys doing?" he'd ask. And every time, Linda answered the same. "We're fine." She didn't tell him that she and Frank hadn't touched each other in months. That sometimes, she missed being alone more than she missed being loved. That when she closed her eyes at night, she wondered how long two people could sleep in the same bed and still feel 1,000 miles apart. Frank, for his part, didn't know how to fix it, or even if it could be fixed. He just knew that the woman who used to laugh at his dumb jokes now barely looked at him. And maybe he deserved that. Maybe retirement had taken more from him than a job title. It had taken his usefulness, and without it, he didn't know how to be a husband. That morning, when Linda pushed back her chair and walked out of the kitchen, Frank didn't follow her. He just stared at the bill in his hand, but he wasn't reading it anymore. He was thinking about how a marriage doesn't break all at once. It crumbles, coffee cup by coffee cup, silence by silence, until one day, you realize the person across from you is a stranger who knows your birthday and your blood type, but nothing about your heart. This was the morning Linda decided something had to change. And it would. Just not in the way either of them expected. It started small. A dish left in the sink. Towels folded the wrong way. Laundry that never made it back to the drawers. Linda didn't mention it at first. What was the point? After all, Frank had never been the tidy one. But lately, every little thing seemed to echo louder in the quiet house. One morning, she found his socks stuffed behind the recliner. Again. She stared at them for a long minute, heart pounding with a strange mix of resentment and grief. That night, over dinner, another meal eaten in near silence, she finally spoke up. "Frank," she said, not looking at him, "I think it's time we divide the housework. 50-50. Like adults." Frank blinked, fork halfway to his mouth. "Since when?" "Since 30 years ago. But I let it slide. That was my mistake. I was working all those years, Linda. So was I. You worked part-time at the bank. I worked full-time in this house. And outside it. And now, we're both retired. So, what's your excuse now?" He set down his fork with a clang. "Don't do this?" "Do what?" "Ask you to pick up after yourself, like a grown man? You're making a big deal out of nothing." "No," Linda said, her voice trembling. "This is me finally saying I'm done cleaning up after someone who doesn't even say thank you." Frank didn't reply. He stood, scraped his plate into the trash, and walked out of the kitchen. The sound of the TV followed moments later, louder than usual. That night, Linda couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, listening to Frank's breathing beside her. It felt like sleeping next to a stranger in a hotel room, someone whose presence made her feel more alone than if she were by herself. The next morning, Frank tried doing the laundry. He didn't say he would, she just heard the machine start and peeked into the laundry room. There he was, standing awkwardly in front of the washer, holding a basket like it was a bomb. He didn't ask for help. He poured detergent like orange juice, crammed colors and whites together, and pressed the button with hope and prayer. Linda said nothing. 3 hours later, she found one of his white shirts dyed pink. A red sock had snuck in. She said nothing then, either. But she noticed that night, when she brought her laundry to the room, Frank was already there, standing beside the washer with a look that was equal parts confusion and shame. "Need help?" she asked, softly. "I'm good," he said quickly. Too quickly. She nodded, dropped her laundry into the basket, and walked away. It was the last time she offered. In the days that followed, Frank began retreating. Not dramatically, just withdrawing. He stopped reading the paper. Started staying up later, watching crime shows he didn't even like. He skipped lunch, forgot trash day. And when Linda stopped cooking dinner altogether, he didn't ask why. He microwaved frozen burritos and ate them alone, standing by the sink. They began passing each other like ghosts, two people occupying the same space, bound by a mortgage and memories, but nothing else. One afternoon, Linda was cleaning out an old drawer when she found a notebook. It was filled with her handwritten budgets, grocery lists, and monthly expenses dating back decades. She flipped through the pages, years of tiny sacrifices, canceled vacations, thrift store receipts, the time she skipped buying a new coat so Jason could go to summer camp. She left the notebook on the kitchen table. Frank never opened it. Later that week, the tension cracked again. "You used to make dinner every night," Frank muttered one evening, rummaging through the freezer. Linda didn't look up from her crossword. "You used to talk to me?" He slammed the freezer shut. "And you used to be kind," she added quietly, like an afterthought, before all the bitterness settled in. Frank stood there for a beat, then walked out. In the stillness that followed, Linda exhaled deeply. She wasn't angry anymore. Just tired. Bone-deep tired. She picked up the notebook he had ignored and put it back in the drawer. Maybe someday he'd want to know the cost of everything she had carried for 30 years. But not today. That night, she folded her laundry with care, put her own plate in the dishwasher, and went to bed, alone in a room she still shared with someone who had long stopped seeing her. It was a Thursday afternoon, gray and damp, the kind that made Linda's knees ache and Frank's mood worse. Linda decided to vacuum the living room, mostly to fill the silence. Frank had gone out that morning, said he had errands, though he didn't say where. She didn't ask. As she was tidying up near his recliner, she noticed his drawer was slightly open. She never snooped. Not really. But the drawer had been sticking lately, and she thought she might fix it. She tugged it gently, and that's when a thick envelope fell out. Linda picked it up. Inside was a mess of papers, credit card statements, cash advance slips, and a small booklet with the bold, unmistakable logo of Bet Now Sportsbook. Her breath caught. She sat down. Hands trembling, she laid out the documents like pieces of a broken puzzle. $2,000 here, $1,500 there. A final tally that made her stomach twist. Over $8,000 in debt. There was no note, no explanation, just silence and numbers. When Frank walked through the door an hour later, she didn't say hello. She didn't even look at him. She simply placed the envelope on the dining table and stepped back. "What's this?" he asked, already knowing. "You tell me," she said, voice flat. Frank opened the envelope and didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "It's not what it looks like." Linda raised an eyebrow. "So you didn't lose $8,000 gambling online?" Frank looked down. "It got out of hand. I thought I could win it back." She laughed, not cruelly, but with the sound of someone who'd run out of emotions to burn. "Win it back? Do you even hear yourself? I didn't want to tell you until I fixed it. That's the problem, Frank. You didn't tell me. You hid it." Like a child hiding a broken lamp and hoping no one notices. "I was ashamed." "You should be." There was silence, heavy, tense, and absolute. Then Linda said something she had never said before. Not in anger, not in passing, not even during the worst fights. "I want you to sleep in the guest room tonight." Frank blinked. "Linda." "No, I need space. From your secrets. From your selfishness. From this version of you I don't even recognize." He didn't argue. He just picked up the envelope, walked down the hall, and closed the guest room door behind him. The next morning, their son Jason showed up unexpectedly. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "You sounded off yesterday. Everything okay?" Linda hesitated. Then, for once, she told the truth. "Your father's been gambling. Online. I found out yesterday. There's about $8,000 in debt." Jason stared at her. "You're serious?" She nodded. "He told you why?" "No, but I don't think he even knows." Jason sat down slowly. I mean, he always liked poker nights with the guys. But this? 8,000? Linda poured him coffee. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. It's not the money, Jason. It's the lying, the hiding, the pretending like I'm the maid and he's the victim. Jason looked away. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. Frank walked in a few minutes later. He froze when he saw Jason. Didn't expect you? I didn't expect to find out you're gambling either, Jason said sharply. Frank looked at Linda, then at his son. I made a mistake. You made 100 of them, Jason shot back. 1 for every dollar you hid. Frank tried to stay calm. I'm handling it. How? You don't even have a job. I'll find something. Jason stood. You know what hurts. Dad, I looked up to you. I thought you were solid, reliable. Turns out you've been hiding behind Mom this whole time. Frank flinched. That's not fair. Jason looked at Linda. You okay? She nodded. I will be. He kissed her on the cheek and left, not saying goodbye to Frank. That night, Linda sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. She heard the soft creak of the screen door and knew Frank had come out. He didn't sit next to her. He stood at the railing, hands in his pockets. I'm sorry, he said, after a while. You've said that before. I mean it. I don't doubt that. But meaning it doesn't change much, does it? No, I guess it doesn't. Linda looked up at him, eyes tired but not cruel. I spent 30 years trusting you, Frank. Even when I didn't like you, I still believed in you. And now, I don't know who I married. Frank turned away, staring at the street. I don't know who I am either. And for once, they were both telling the truth. The next morning, Linda folded the sheets with mechanical precision. The guest room bed, Frank's new bed, had been hastily made, the blanket uneven, the pillows tossed. He hadn't even tried. She didn't care. At least, that's what she told herself. For years, their bedroom had been neutral ground. Arguments might brew in the kitchen or flare in the living room, but the bedroom was where they returned to silence, to sleep, not to connect, not anymore. But even silence has its limit. That morning, Linda stood at the threshold of the bedroom they once shared and made her decision. That evening, after dinner, which they ate separately, again, she walked past Frank as he sat on the couch, remote in hand, staring at the glowing TV screen but seeing none of it. I'm moving into the spare room, she said, not waiting for a response. Frank looked up, startled. Why? She turned to face him. Because sleeping next to someone I no longer trust is exhausting. It's just a bed, Linda. No, Frank. It's never just a bed. It's shared space. It's safety. It's intimacy. And all of that's gone. He stood slowly, like he wanted to stop her, but didn't know how. Look, I'm trying. I'm figuring things out. Are you? Or are you just hoping I'll forget again? He had no answer. Linda gathered her pillow and a blanket that smelled like lavender, her favorite scent, and walked into the spare room. It was colder than she remembered. The walls were bare, the mattress stiff. But the silence was hers alone, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to hold her breath to sleep. She shut the door with a soft but resolute thud. Frank sat on the couch long after the credits rolled. He looked over at the hallway where the bedroom door had once stood open every night. Now, it was closed. A line had been drawn, not with words, but with distance. The days that followed were quiet in a new, unfamiliar way. They no longer spoke unless necessary. Trash goes out tomorrow. Your doctor left a message. The mail's on the table. But the tone had shifted. The detachment wasn't just emotional anymore. It had become spatial. The house wasn't theirs together anymore. It was two territories sharing plumbing. One morning, Linda stood in front of her closet, unsure what to wear. She wasn't going anywhere, but for some reason, she felt like dressing up. She chose a blouse she hadn't worn in years, applied light lipstick, and looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't look young, but she didn't look broken either. Frank passed by the hallway, saw her reflection in the mirror, and paused. She didn't see him, but he saw her, fully, perhaps for the first time in a long time. Not as the housekeeper. Not as the woman who made lists and folded his shirts and reminded him to take his blood pressure pills, but as someone he'd once loved, maybe still did. He wasn't sure. That night, he stood outside the spare room, unsure whether to knock. He raised his hand, then dropped it. He turned away. Linda heard the soft shuffle, the pause. She stared at the ceiling, willing herself not to cry. A week later, Jason called. "How are you guys holding up?" he asked. Linda hesitated. "We're managing, still sleeping in separate rooms." "Yes." "Do you think that's permanent?" "I don't know. But it's necessary." Jason was silent for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "I think it's okay, Mom. I think sometimes it's braver to stay and set boundaries than to leave." She felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you." That evening, Linda and Frank both stood in the kitchen. The silence felt different, less like a battlefield, more like a truce. Linda reached for the kettle. "I'm making tea. Do you want some?" Frank blinked. "Yeah, sure." She poured 2 cups, handed one to him. Their fingers touched for a brief second. It was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. They stood at opposite ends of the counter, sipping in silence. Frank cleared his throat. "That room, is it comfortable?" Linda nodded. "It's quiet." He looked down. "I miss the noise." She didn't answer. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was the only one listening. That night, as Linda turned out the light in the spare room, she thought about the phrase she once read in a counseling article. Emotional separation is not the end. It's a message. The question is whether you're ready to hear it. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and whispered into the dark. "I hear it now." It had been over a month since Linda moved into the spare room. The days blurred into routines, laundry on Wednesdays, groceries on Saturdays, polite silence in between. Frank had begun to take over some chores, but not out of partnership. It was more like 2 roommates splitting rent, minus the rent. Linda felt numb. One Thursday afternoon, she stepped into Willow Grove Community Center, a beige building she used to pass by without a second glance. They were offering a free calligraphy workshop for retirees, and the flyer in the grocery store window had caught her eye. Maybe she just wanted a room that didn't hold memories. She walked into the classroom and was greeted by the smell of fresh paper and old perfume. A group of women, mostly in their 60s and 70s, were already seated, chatting softly. "Linda?" A voice called out. She turned. Her breath caught. Margaret? They hadn't seen each other in 10 years. Margaret used to be her co-worker at the bank, a sharp-witted woman with a warm laugh. Life had pulled them apart after retirement, as it often does. They embraced, awkward but real. Over the next hour, they dipped bamboo pens into black ink and practiced writing words like peace, breathe and strength on cream parchment. It felt oddly therapeutic. After class, they sat in the center's tiny cafe, each nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. "You look different," Margaret said gently. Linda offered a half smile. "I feel different. Want to talk about it?" Linda hesitated. Then, for the first time since the guest room door had closed, she let the truth out. "We haven't slept in the same room for over a month." Margaret didn't flinch. "In fact," Linda continued, "we barely talk. We exist near each other, not with each other. It's like emotional ghosting." Margaret stirred her tea. "I know the feeling." Linda looked up, surprised. "I divorced Paul 2 years ago," Margaret said quietly. "I had no idea." "No one does. It's not something you post on Facebook next to a vacation photo. But it happened. And it was hard." Linda leaned in. "Do you regret it?" Margaret paused, then shook her head slowly. "I regret that we couldn't save it. But not that we stopped pretending." Linda said nothing. Margaret continued. "I used to wake up in the morning, see his face, and think, he's still breathing. Damn. That's when I knew something was broken." Linda let out a laugh, short, shocked, but real. Margaret smiled sadly. "But here's the thing. It wasn't just him. I spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife, the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the scheduler. I thought if I did everything right, he'd see me. But all he saw was a routine." Linda felt her throat tighten. Margaret leaned forward. "Maybe it's not about who failed. Maybe we were just trying to do marriage with broken instructions." The cafe grew quieter. Afternoon light spilled across the linoleum floor. Margaret said, more softly now, "But you know what I've realized, Linda? Marriage isn't just about staying. It's about seeing each other for who we are, not just what we do." Linda nodded slowly. "Frank sees the bills I pay, the food I make, the laundry I fold. But he hasn't looked me in the eyes in years." Margaret smiled. "Then maybe it's time you looked in the mirror first." They hugged before leaving. This time, it wasn't awkward. It was grounding. As Linda drove home, Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "It's not about who failed." She pulled into the driveway, parked, and sat for a long moment, engine off, key in hand. Inside, Frank was watching TV again. Same channel, same silence. She passed behind him without speaking, but stopped at the kitchen counter, reached into her purse, pulled out one of the practice sheets from class. She wrote a word in soft ink strokes. "Rediscover." Then she folded it neatly and left it on the dining table. No note, no message, just a possibility. That night, she lay in bed, her bed, and thought not about endings, but about beginnings that happen quietly, without anyone noticing. Beginnings that start with a pen, and a word, and the courage to stop pretending. The library had always been one of Frank's safe places. Long before retirement, he would spend Saturday mornings there browsing nonfiction titles, sipping bitter vending machine coffee, and pretending he was too busy to go home early. Now, it had become a quiet hideaway, a place where no one expected him to talk, to explain, or to feel useful. That Thursday afternoon, he sat in the large reading room, a biography of Teddy Roosevelt open in front of him, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. He wasn't reading. He was just existing. Across from him sat a man about his age, maybe a few years older. Neatly dressed, silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses. He was jotting something down in a notebook. Frank glanced at the cover. Grief Support Journal. The man looked up and caught his eye. Teddy fan? Frank blinked. Yeah, sort of. The man smiled politely. Hell of a life he lived. Mine's been less presidential. Frank chuckled under his breath. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the kind only two older men can manage without discomfort. Then the man said, I'm Tom. I come here Thursdays. After group. Frank nodded. Frank, retired DMV. Grief group, Tom added. Lost my wife 5 years ago. Frank shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry. Tom shrugged gently. Thank you. We were married 42 years. You'd think that would prepare a man. It doesn't? Tom looked at him, steady and tired. Nothing prepares you to realize you missed most of your marriage while you were in it. Frank felt a chill creep into his chest. Tom continued. You work, you raise kids, you mow lawns. You think sharing bills is the same as sharing life. Then, one day, she's not there. And all the questions you never asked start screaming. He looked down at his notebook. My wife's name was Helen. Smart, funny, fierce when she was mad. Frank smiled faintly. Sounds like someone I know. Tom sighed. Last year of her life, she had cancer. Slow, cruel kind. I was there, every day. Made her soup, measured out meds, even changed her bedding. Thought I was being a good husband. He swallowed. Then, 2 days before she died, she said something I'll never forget. Frank leaned in slightly. She said, You never saw me. Not really. You loved me like a job. The words landed like a stone in Frank's gut. She said, You knew when I needed pills, but not when I needed to be held. You saw when I cooked, cleaned, planned holidays, but never noticed when I was lonely. Tom paused, his voice catching. And she was right. I gave her presence, but not presence of mind, of heart. I thought doing things for her was enough, but I never really saw her. Frank looked down at his own hands. The calluses were gone now, but the blindness, that remained. Tom took a sip of his coffee. I live alone now. Sometimes I hear her voice when I walk into the kitchen, not because I'm haunted, just because I finally started listening. Frank whispered, What would you do if you could go back? Tom smiled sadly. I'd hold her hand for no reason. I'd ask how she's really feeling and wait for the real answer. I'd say thank you for small things. And I'd stop acting like I had forever. He closed the journal. But I can't. And I wouldn't wish this kind of regret on anyone. They sat quietly again, the sound of distant pages turning around them. Then Tom said, You still married? Frank nodded slowly. Technically, emotionally, I'm not sure. Tom looked him in the eyes. If she's still in your house, still breathing, you've got time. Don't waste it waiting for a funeral to learn how to love. Frank said nothing. Tom stood, gathered his things, and placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. I don't know you, but I can tell you this, it's not too late until it is. And with that, he walked away. Frank sat there for a long time, unmoving. Those words, you never saw me, repeated in his head like a broken loop. How many times had Linda sat across from him, hoping he'd notice her smile, her sadness, her presence? How many times had he chosen silence instead? He closed the Roosevelt book, returned it to the shelf, and walked to his car. He didn't drive off right away. Just sat behind the wheel, staring at the steering wheel like it held answers. At home, the lights were off in Linda's room. He paused outside her door. He raised his hand, then lowered it. But he didn't go to the guest room. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, pulled out a piece of mail, flipped it over, and began writing. Not to fix everything, just to finally say something real. The note sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Linda noticed it. She almost threw it out, thinking it was junk mail. But the handwriting caught her eye, a little shaky, unfamiliar, as if the person who wrote it hadn't held a pen in years. It was Frank's. It read, "Linda, I don't know how to undo the years, or the words I never said. But I'm trying to learn how to be someone who sees you now, not as the keeper of the house, but as the woman I've ignored for too long. I know I may be decades late, but I'm still here. Frank." She read it twice, then a third time. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, but she didn't throw it away. That weekend, she walked into the kitchen to find Frank washing dishes, by hand. No fanfare, no big moment, just soap, water, and a slightly crooked spine bent over the sink. "You're using too much soap," she said without looking at him. Frank glanced over. "Probably." He handed her a dish towel. "Want to help?" She hesitated, then stepped beside him. For the next 15 minutes, they moved in silence. She washed. He dried. No one said anything, but the air felt different. Less heavy. Less sharp. Afterward, she poured 2 cups of tea and sat down across from him. They didn't talk about the note, but they didn't need to. In the following weeks, small changes began to ripple through their quiet world. Frank applied for a part-time job at a local janitorial service, cleaning office buildings after hours. The work was hard on his knees, and he came home sore most nights, but he never complained. He said it gave him purpose. Linda started going to calligraphy class twice a week instead of once. She began spending afternoons designing greeting cards for community fundraisers. One day, she even laughed, out loud, at a joke someone told in class. At dinner, Frank cooked once. It was awful, oversalted pasta and watery sauce. Linda ate every bite. He watched her, surprised. "You're not going to say anything?" "I already did." "I said thank you." Frank looked down, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's new?" She nodded. "So is the cooking." They didn't fall in love again. They didn't hold hands or kiss in the hallway. This wasn't a romance reborn. It was something else. Something quieter, gentler, respect. Jason visited a month later and blinked in disbelief when he walked into the house. "Is this music?" he asked, hearing soft jazz in the background. Frank shrugged. "Your mom likes Coltrane." Jason raised an eyebrow. "You hate jazz?" "Trying new things," Frank muttered, sipping his tea. Jason turned to Linda. "Are you guys back together?" Linda looked at Frank, then back at Jason. "No, but we're trying to be decent human beings to each other again." Jason laughed. "That's more than most married couples I know." That night, Linda left a folded paper on Frank's nightstand. He opened it. Inside was a calligraphy piece, clean, elegant strokes on handmade paper. The word, stillness. No note, no explanation, just a message. On her way to class the next morning, Linda caught Frank standing in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. He looked almost nervous. "You have a job interview?" She teased. He grinned. "Already working, remember? Just trying to look decent." She tilted her head. "For who?" He hesitated, then said softly, "For the woman I used to eat breakfast with." "And maybe," still might. Linda shook her head, amused. Flattery doesn't suit you, Frank. I'm new at this, he replied. She walked past him and paused at the door. You're not bad at it. Later that evening, Frank walked into the kitchen to find a plate waiting for him, reheated casserole, carefully covered in foil. Next to it was a sticky note. Don't get used to this. One-time offer. He smiled, sat down, ate alone, but not lonely. Linda, in her room, heard his laughter drift through the hallway. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't close the door all the way. 1 year after Linda moved into the spare room, the Carters' house looked mostly the same from the outside. Same beige siding. Same flower beds Linda tended with quiet care. Same wind chime that never quite stopped squeaking. But inside, things were different. The silence was still there, but it had softened. It no longer hung like a heavy fog. It was more like morning mist, the kind that lifts once the sun warms the air. Linda still slept in the spare room. Frank still made terrible coffee. But somehow, neither of them felt alone anymore. It started with the little things. Frank learned to fold towels the Linda way, thirds, then half. He even wrote it on a sticky note inside the linen closet. Linda stopped double-checking his chores. When he left the trash out too long, she simply reminded him once, without the loaded sighs of old. And every Friday, they made tea at 8 p.m. together. It wasn't a ritual, exactly, but it was theirs. One morning, Linda walked into the kitchen holding an envelope. Frank looked up from the sink. Another bill? She shook her head. No. Invitation. To what? I've been invited to submit a piece to the community art show next month. Frank blinked. Really? She smiled. A real one. Apparently, old women with ink-stained fingers are in high demand. He chuckled. I'd love to see your work. She raised an eyebrow. You actually want to come? I want to support you, he said quietly. She didn't respond. But she left the envelope on the table, where he could find the date and time. That was answer enough. 2 weeks later, Frank came home holding a small bag. He handed it to Linda without a word. Inside was a new set of calligraphy brushes, tied together with a red ribbon. She stared at them for a long moment. Then at him. You remembered? You said yours were fraying, he said. Thought maybe, this time, I could give you something that helped build, instead of fix. Linda nodded. Thank you, Frank. He didn't need her to say more. At the exhibit, Frank stood silently in front of her piece. It was large, bolder than her usual style. The brushstrokes were sweeping and deliberate. The word at the center, release. Frank read the artist's note beneath it. Letting go doesn't always mean walking away. And sometimes it means making space for yourself, for the other, for truth. This piece is a thank you to those who taught me that. He turned to Linda, who stood beside him, hands clasped in front of her, nervous. It's beautiful, he said. She glanced at him. It's about us. I know. They didn't say anything else, but he reached for her hand. And for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. After the show, they walked to the car under the soft buzz of street lamps. Frank cleared his throat. You know, I still think about that guest room. Linda smirked. Don't get any ideas. No, I mean, it saved us. Gave us space to become real people again. Not just roles. Linda nodded slowly. You're not the man I married, and I'm not the woman you said I do to. I don't think I'd want to go back anyway. Neither would I. They got into the car, silence wrapping around them like a worn blanket. Back at home, Linda made chamomile tea while Frank took out the trash. The rhythm of a quiet evening. As they sat at the table, Frank looked at her with a mix of hesitation and hope. I don't know what we are now. Not husband and wife in the old sense. Linda took a sip of tea. We're people who care, who live gently beside each other. He nodded. That's enough for me. She looked up. It is for me, too. Jason came to visit a week later. He noticed the open doors, the soft jazz in the background, the 2 mugs on the drying rack. Things seem calmer, he said. Frank chuckled. We're not trying to win anymore. Just trying not to lose each other entirely. Jason looked at his mother. Are you happy? She thought for a moment, then said, I'm peaceful. That counts more at this age. Jason nodded. Yeah, it does. That night, Linda sat in bed, her own bed, and flipped through a small journal she had started months ago. At the top of each page was a word. Distance, anger, shame, stillness, and finally, grace. She closed the journal, turned off the light, and whispered into the darkness. Good night, Frank. From down the hall, his voice echoed back. Good night, Linda. No grand declarations. No dramatic reunions. Just 2 people, learning to walk gently around each other again. In a world obsessed with falling back in love, they had chosen something quieter. They chose to stay, not out of habit, not out of guilt, but out of something more honest, respect, peace, and the courage to live the rest of their lives with open eyes and softer hearts. Some relationships don't break with yelling. They unravel with silence. Frank and Linda didn't fall apart overnight. Their marriage faded through decades of unspoken resentment, unshared burdens, and one-sided effort. It was never explosive. It was quiet, tired, and invisible to everyone but themselves. And yet, this story isn't a tragedy. Because while they couldn't rewind 30 years, they discovered something even more powerful than reconciliation. They found clarity. They found dignity. And most importantly, they chose to stop hurting each other, even if it meant no longer being husband and wife in the traditional sense. What we take from this is simple. Relationships aren't just about staying together. They're about evolving together, about making space when needed, about offering grace instead of blame. Sometimes the bravest kind of love is not romance, it's respect. It's stepping away without walking out. And it's recognizing that peace, not passion, may be the most beautiful ending of all. If this story struck a chord with you, take a moment to like the video so more people can find it. Leave us a comment below. Have you ever shared a home with someone who felt like a stranger? What helped you heal? Did distance bring peace or only more pain? Your story might mean the world to someone else who's going through the same silence. And if you want more stories that speak to real hearts, real lives, and real change, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Or